Hello, folks. Welcome to what may be the first video for AP Psych. Glad you tuned in today. I'll be talking for a few minutes, maybe up to 10 minutes, about the history of psychology, some of the famous people, some of the subfields of psychology, the definitions of psychology, and a little bit about the perspectives. So that's what's in this video today. Let me go ahead and pull this up. Okay, so here it is. The three questions we're going to look at are: how did psychology as a field get started? Who were the important figures? And what are the different types of psychologists? Well, the first important figure wasn't even a psychologist. It was Charles Darwin. But his evolutionary theory had a big impact on psychology. His idea that organisms change as they adapt to their environment. Through natural selection, we pass on traits. There's a whole field of psychology called evolutionary psychology, which focuses on how thoughts and behaviors might be selected and passed on. And he also influenced many of the other early psychologists who were not necessarily evolutionary psychologists. But an example of things that an evolutionary psychologist might study, a lot of people dislike bitter foods like broccoli. And so one thought is that maybe that was adaptable at some time, that maybe dangerous foods, poisonous plants, or stuff that was rotten, it might help us to have that trait of disliking bitter foods. Another thing would be like a fear of heights. Throughout evolutionary history, it would be beneficial to maybe have a little bit of apprehension about high places. That would help us survive, so that trait lives on in us today. So one of the people Darwin influenced was William James. Actually, I got out of order there. A person that was the first psychologist was Wilhelm Wundt. He's known as the first psychologist. He opened the first psychology research lab in 1879 in Germany. And he was mainly studying sensations and reaction times and perceptions. They called it introspection, was the technique. And overall, all of his work was called structuralism because they were trying to study the structures of the mind involved in those sensations and perceptions. So prior to him, people were just hypothesizing, theorizing, and psychology was mainly a philosophy. So when he opens a research lab is when it becomes a science. So William James is the guy who was really influenced by Darwin. He's known as the first American psychologist. He wrote the first big textbook on psychology. He was interested in how consciousness had evolved to help humans survive and function. So his type of thought was called functionalism because it was not interested, like Wundt was on the specific structures of the mind. William James was focused on the functioning of the mind. But before James, I said he was the first American psychologist. There were people in the United States working in the field of mental health, and one of them was Dorothea Dix. In the 1840s, she was investigating how the mentally ill were treated, and she was finding out that a lot of them were caged up or put in pens and just treated horribly. Not healthy food, not good living situations, not good hygiene. So she starts advocating for the mentally ill, and she starts, because of her work, the first mental hospitals or mental asylums open up as a place to keep the mentally ill that was much more humane than the way some of them were being treated. G. Stanley Hall is another important person in the history of psychology. He opened the first psychology research lab in the United States. He also published the first journal, the Psychology Journal, in the United States, and that was in 1887. And he became the first president of the American Psychological Association. The slide says 1992. That's really 1892. Sorry about the typo. So he was a pioneer in many ways as well. Now, everything wasn't great early on, so James and Hall are doing all this pioneering work. There was a woman, Mary Whiton Calkins, who was a student of William James, and she wanted to learn about psychology, and James was happy to teach her, but when she came to class, all of the male students left class. They refused to be in class with the female. This was at Harvard University. So James started tutoring her on his own on the side. When she finished all the work, Harvard refused to give her the degree, even though she had done all the work and James had taught her. She did finish her work at Harvard, though, and she went on to become, this is the good part, she went on to become the first female president of the American Psychological Association. So she was a pioneer. Now the good news is half of all psychology students in American colleges are women. Actually, more than half are women. One of those women who followed in her footsteps was Margaret Floyd Washburn. She was the first woman to earn a PhD in psychology. She also became president of the APA. So I'm not covering everybody right now. Some super influential people early on were Sigmund Freud and John Watson and Ivan Pavlov. We're going to get to those guys over the course of the year, but just not right now. So what is psychology? Early on, there was a real emphasis on the scientific study of observable behavior. Only what you could observe mattered, so what was going on in the mind or the heart was not really part of psychology. Today, that has changed. It started to change in the 1960s. So today, the definition of psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes, which means your thoughts and your feelings. So there's also this thing you should be aware of called perspectives. So psychology has different perspectives, and what that means is that, well, human beings are super complex. We have thoughts, we have feelings, we have behaviors. We're influenced by our family, our friends. We're influenced by the environment. So there's lots of things. We're influenced by our biology, our hormones, our chemicals in our brain. So there's lots of ways to look at a human being and try to understand them, and there's lots of aspects to study or specialize in. So these are called the perspectives. So I'm not going to get into what they all mean right now, but I just want you to know that the idea is out there, that there are different perspectives. And I'll give you an example. So let's say that someone's depressed. They're very sad. They've been sad for weeks. They can't get over being sad. Different people, different psychologists might interpret that differently, and they might try to solve the problem of depression differently. If you were in the biological perspective, you might try to treat the depression with medication. If you were in the cognitive perspective, which focuses on thoughts, you might try to do therapy and help people come up with different ways of interpreting their reality and maybe changing their depression because of that. So we're going to get into the different perspectives throughout the year. Just wanted to give you a notice that that is coming. So a couple of the big organizations in psychology, I already mentioned the APA, the American Psychological Association, has over 160,000 members worldwide. The British Psychological Association has 34,000 members. So there are lots of psychologists out there practicing in the world. So what's the difference between psychology and psychiatry? Well, the two main types of psychologists that you probably think of when you think of psychology, a lot of people, that is, think of someone who's doing therapy. You go to their office, you talk about your problems, they help you with therapy. So those two types of psychologists are clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists. You might also, if you have a problem, go to a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor, which is different from a psychologist. And the medical doctor will likely treat your disorder or whatever with a medication. So a psychiatrist is more about medication, and when you go visit them, you do medication checkups and you talk about side effects or if it's working or not working. With a clinical psychologist or a counseling psychologist, you would talk about stuff with your family or your past, or you broke up with your girlfriend, or your future and you're worried about something. So you would talk about all those things in therapy with a psychologist. Now, a psychiatrist might talk about that stuff a little bit. You'll just do it more with a psychologist. Okay, what about subfields? So I just mentioned clinical and counseling psychologists. There's also educational psychologists, industrial and organizational psychologists. So there's an ed psych at the high school, and she would test people and find out maybe if they have autism or if they have dyslexia, and she would come up with strategies to help them deal with those sorts of things. An industrial organizational psychologist works with businesses, maybe helps them come up with management strategies, or maybe finds out ways to market their products better. So those sorts of psychologists work in the business world. Now, these are called applied because you're out there working in the world. Here's how it breaks down. Lots of clinical psychologists and then fewer of these other categories. There's also research subfields. Now, these people would be doing research. They would be likely working at a university and researching these different topics, exploring the links between the brain and the mind, developmental, or studying kids, studying thoughts, studying personality, and studying social factors. There are actually over 50 subfields of psychology, and you can go to the APA's website, and I have that website on the note guide, so you can check out all the different subfields that aren't listed in this presentation. One of the cool ones is sports psychology. A lot of times professional sports teams or maybe big universities would have a sports psychologist on staff, and that person would help the athletes improve their performance or deal with the demands of life, that sort of thing. So that's a cool subfield. Here's how the research subfields break down. And that's it for today. So if you have any questions, if anything wasn't on the note guide, or if you don't understand anything, that's fine. I hope you took good notes, and you can ask me in class and I will explain anything else that needs to be explained. All right, have a good day.